My best friends will demand it I open this box. Inside, a photo of my wife, dated 5 years before we ever met. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The Johannesburg sun did not mourn. It beat down on the black suits and designer sunglasses of the mourners with a relentless, golden indifference. Kofi stood at the edge of the grave, the red dust of the high felt clinging to his Italian leather shoes, feeling a hollow space in his chest where 20 years of brotherhood used to reside. Elias had been the sun in their social solar system, a man of sharp wit and even sharper business instincts, and his sudden passing was a structural failure in Kofi's world. As the dirt hit the casket with a final, rhythmic thud, the lawyer, a man named Mvimba with eyes like cold stones, leaned in to whisper that the private reading would take place at sunset. Kofi looked over at Zola, his wife of 3 years, whose grief seemed etched in marble, her face a mask of dignified sorrow that felt almost too perfect, like a statue in a high-end gallery. She didn't look at him. She looked at the hole in the earth, her fingers twisting the diamond band on her left hand until the skin turned white, a gesture of nervous habit that Kofi had never noticed until the silence became this loud. The law office in Sandton was a cathedral of glass and steel, overlooking the sprawling canopy of the city's northern suburbs. Mvimba didn't waste time with platitudes, instead sliding a heavy, dark mahogany box across the polished desk, its surface scarred by a single, deep scratch near the lock. He was very specific. Kofi, the lawyer said, his voice grating like sandpaper against the hum of the air conditioning. This box was never to be opened while he breathed. But the moment his heart stopped, it became your inheritance, your burden, and your instruction. Kofi felt the coolness of the wood beneath his palms, the weight of it suggesting something far denser than paper or jewelry, something that possessed its own gravity. He remembered Elias laughing over drinks a year ago, pointing at a similar box on a shelf and warning Kofi that curiosity was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, the luxury was gone, replaced by a mandate from the grave. And, as Kofi turned the box over in his hands, he felt the first cold prickle of a dread he couldn't name, a sense that the man he called his best friend had left behind a bomb with a very long, very silent fuse. The air in the office felt recycled, stripped of oxygen as Mvimba cleared his throat to read the final codicil of the will. It wasn't a list of assets or a distribution of shares, but a narrative directive that felt uncomfortably personal for a legal setting. To my brother, Kofi, the lawyer read, his voice devoid of the emotion the words demanded, I leave you the truth because I can no longer afford a lie to the man who gave me everything. Kofi felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, the air in a room suddenly feeling thick and humid, reminiscent of the heavy rains that preceded a Josie thunderstorm. He thought of their shared history, the late-night deals, the double dates, the way Elias had stood as his best man, beaming with a pride that Kofi had always taken as brotherly love. But the language of the will was shifting, turning from fraternal to frantic, a desperate plea for acknowledgement that felt like a hand reaching out from the dark. The box contains the keys to a house you didn't know you lived in. Mvimba continued, pausing to look at Kofi with a flicker of something that looked dangerously like pity. Kofi wanted to reach out and snatch the paper, to stop the clinical dissection of his friendship, but he was paralyzed by the sheer weight of the mahogany chest sitting between them. It felt like a living thing, a silent witness to a history he was beginning to realize he had only half understood. He looked at the heavy brass lock, the metal tarnished by the oils of Elias's skin, and realized that his best friend hadn't just died. He had checked out, leaving Kofi to settle a debt he didn't know he owed. When the lawyer finally handed him the small, silver skeleton key, his fingers were trembling, not with the weakness of grief, but with the vibration of a looming catastrophe. He walked out of the office and into the neon-soaked evening of Johannesburg, the box tucked under his arm like a stolen secret, feeling for the first time that the woman waiting for him at home was a stranger he had only just met. The drive back to the suburban quiet of Bryanston was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt. But inside the car, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of the mahogany box resting on the passenger seat. Kofi gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white, his mind replaying the lawyer's cryptic warnings like a distorted record. Beside him, the box seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent passenger carrying the weight of a friendship that was rapidly transforming into a mystery. He thought of his house, the modern, glass-walled sanctuary he shared with Zola, and wondered if the foundation was as solid as he'd always believed. The city's skyline, usually a symbol of his success and his shared dreams with Elias, now felt like a jagged fence keeping him trapped in a reality that was beginning to fracture. Every red light felt like an interrogation, every shadow in the rearview mirror a ghost of Elias's laugh, mocking him for his blind trust. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sweat had soaked through his silk shirt, and the mahogany box felt less like an inheritance and more like a heavy, wooden anchor dragging him down into the depths of a dark, cold ocean. Once inside, the house felt unervingly large, the minimalist decor and high ceilings amplifying every sound until the click of his shoes on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. Zola was in the kitchen, her back to him, the soft glow of the pendant lights catching the elegant curve of her neck as she poured a glass of wine with a hand that didn't shake. She didn't turn around when he entered, but he could feel her awareness of him, a psychic tension that stretched between them like a tripwire. He bypassed the kitchen and went straight to his study, the mahogany box cradled against his chest as if it were a fragile, wounded bird. He placed it on the center of his desk, the dark wood of the box clashing with the modern glass surface, a relic of the past invading his carefully curated present. He sat there for a long time in the dim light, the silver key heavy in his pocket, listening to the muffled sounds of his wife moving through the house, the soft closing of a door, the distant hum of the television. He realized then that he was afraid, not of what Elias had left him, but of the person he would become once the lock was turned and the silence was finally broken. The silver key slid into the lock with a smoothness that felt almost oily, as if the mechanism had been recently serviced in anticipation of this very moment. When the lid creaked open, the first thing that hit Kofi wasn't a smell of decay or old paper, but the sharp, evocative scent of Zola's signature perfume, the one she only wore on special occasions, the one she'd been wearing the night they met. Tucked into the velvet lining of the lid was a single, high-gloss photograph, the edges slightly curled as if it had been handled many times. Kofi picked it up, his breath catching in his throat as he saw Zola standing on a sun-drenched balcony in Cape Town, the Table Mountain silhouette unmistakable in the background. She looked younger, her hair styled in a way he'd never seen, laughing at something off-camera with a genuine, unburdened joy that made his heart ache. But it was the date stamped in the bottom right corner in digital yellow ink that made the room tilt. August 14th, 2018. That was 5 years before their first supposed meeting at a business gala in 2023, 5 years before she had supposedly even moved back to South Africa from her studies abroad. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a cold wave of nausea rising in his stomach as he stared at the woman in the photo who was, and yet wasn't, his wife. In 2018, Kofi had been struggling to launch his firm, leaning heavily on Elias for emotional support and seed capital, while Zola was, according to her own stories, living in a small flat in London, mourning the passing of her grandmother. Yet here she was, glowing under the African sun, looking into the eyes of whoever held the camera with a look of profound, intimate recognition. He turned the photo over, hoping for a name or a location, but found only a single line of Elias's elegant, slanted handwriting, the beginning of the long game. The words felt like a riddle designed to taunt him, a breadcrumb leading into a forest he didn't want to enter. He looked at the photo again, searching for any sign of Elias in the reflection of the glass door behind her, but he saw only the distorted image of himself in the present, a man whose history was being rewritten in real time by a ghost who refused to stay buried. Kofi leaned back in his leather chair, the photo still clutched in his hand, his eyes scanning the familiar furniture of his study as if searching for hidden cameras or microphones. The balcony in the photograph wasn't just any balcony. As he stared at the railing and the specific pattern of the tiling, a chilling recognition began to settle in his bones. It was the penthouse Elias had owned back in 2018, the one he had sold shortly before Kofi and Zola's wedding, claiming he needed the liquid capital for a new venture. Kofi had visited that apartment dozens of times, had drank expensive whiskey on that very balcony, while complaining to Elias about his loneliness and his desire to find a woman who truly understood him. All those nights, Elias had listened with a sympathetic nod, pouring more drinks and offering platitudes about patience and fate, while apparently harboring the very woman Kofi was searching for. The betrayal felt systemic, a deep-rooted rot that suggested every milestone of his adult life had been staged on a set designed by his best friend. He felt a sudden, frantic need to verify the timeline, to find some logical explanation that didn't involve a decade-long conspiracy of silence between the two people he loved most. He thought back to the night he met Zola in 2023, the way she had accidentally spilled champagne on his sleeve, the way her laugh had reminded him of music he'd forgotten how to play. Elias had been there, of course, playing the role of the surprised mutual friend, introducing them with a wink and a comment about how they were made for each other. Now, that meet-cute felt like a scripted scene from a play that had been in rehearsal for years, with Kofi as the only actor who hadn't seen the script. He looked at the mahogany box again, the dark wood seeming to absorb the light of the desk lamp, and felt a surge of anger that burned through his fear. He wasn't just a grieving friend anymore. He was a detective in his own life, and the evidence was piling up in a way that suggested the man he had called his brother had spent years treating him like a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Beneath the photograph lay a thick, cream-colored envelope, the paper heavy and expensive, sealed with a dollop of black wax that bore the imprint of Elias's signet ring. Kofi's hands were steady now, a cold, clinical detachment taking over as he used a letter opener to break the seal, the sound of the paper tearing feeling like a final severance of his old reality. Inside was a stack of letters, perhaps 20 or 30 pages, all written in Zola's unmistakable, flowing cursive, the same hand that wrote his grocery lists and birthday cards. As he unfolded the first page, the date jumped out at him, October 2019. The letter was a raw, visceral outpouring of longing, addressed to a nickname Kofi had never used, a secret designation for a man who was supposed to be a stranger to her. She spoke of the quiet torture of their secret, of the nights spent in the penthouse overlooking the city, and of a plan that required one more year of silence before the pieces could be moved into place. The letters weren't just love notes. They were a chronicle of a shadow life, a parallel narrative that ran alongside his own history like a hidden vein of dark water. She described her role with a chilling precision, discussing how she would eventually approach Kofi, how she would mimic the traits Elias knew Kofi desired in a wife, and how she would carry the secret to the grave if necessary. Kofi read through the pages, his heart thundering against his ribs, feeling the intimacy of their words like a violation. They talked about him as if he were a project, a necessary variable in a larger equation that they were solving together. He is kind, just as you said, she wrote in a letter dated shortly before their first meeting, and he is so hungry for what I am about to give him that he will never look beneath the surface. The betrayal was so complete, so meticulously documented, that Kofi felt a strange sense of awe beneath the agony, a realization that his entire marriage was not a union of souls, but a carefully executed heist where the prize was his own life. The ink on the pages seemed to shimmer under the study's LED lights, each stroke of Zola's pen a needle pricking at the skin of Kofi's memory. In these letters, she wasn't the composed, corporate lawyer he had married. She was a woman possessed by a frantic, jagged passion that he had never once tasted in their 3 years of domesticity. She wrote to Elias about the gray spaces of her days with Kofi, describing their shared life as a necessary performance, a bridge they had to cross to reach some unspoken destination on the other side. She detailed the way she would look at Kofi across the dinner table and see only a silhouette of the man she actually wanted, her words dripping with a guilt that was quickly overwhelmed by a terrifyingly cold pragmatism. Kofi felt his stomach churn as he read a passage from late 2020, where she thanked Elias for the allowance he had provided to keep her family's estate in KwaZulu-Natal afloat, a debt Kofi had been told was settled by a phantom inheritance from an aunt. Every "I love you" he had received now felt like a counterfeit coin, minted in a secret factory owned by his best friend, and the silence of the house around him began to feel like the silence of a tomb where he was the only one still breathing. The betrayal deepened as the letters moved into the present, detailing the mundane details of their marriage, as if she were filing a status report to a superior officer. She wrote about Kofi's promotion, his fears, even his favorite meals, all framed as observations for Elias to analyze and exploit. There was a letter dated during their honeymoon in the Maldives, written on hotel stationery while Kofi had been asleep beside her, where she confessed to Elias that the ocean looked like his eyes and the salt on her skin felt like a betrayal of their true covenant. She spoke of the long game, with a chilling frequency, a phrase that suggested Kofi was merely a temporary custodian of her heart, a placeholder until some cosmic or calculated event allowed her to return to Elias's arms. The intimacy of the letters was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that made Kofi want to tear the pages to shreds, yet he was held captive by the horrific clarity of her prose. He realized that while he had been building a home, they had been building a cage, and the bars were made of the very trust he had offered them so freely. Kofi began to spread the letters across the glass desk, organizing them by date, creating a forensic timeline of his own victimhood. He saw how the frequency of the letters increased whenever he and Elias were working on a major deal, as if the professional closeness of the men triggered a compensatory need for emotional intimacy between the lovers. One letter, dated June 2021, coincided exactly with the week Kofi had been hospitalized with a severe bout of malaria. While he had been shivering in a hospital bed, Zola had been writing to Elias about how the weakness in his eyes makes the plan easier to bear. It was a cold, clinical observation that stripped away the last vestiges of the woman Kofi thought he knew, replacing her with a strategist who viewed his vulnerability as a tactical advantage. He remembered Elias sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand and telling him that he was the brother he never had, while apparently receiving daily updates on Kofi's weakness from the woman waiting in the hallway. The symmetry of the deception was breathtaking, a masterpiece of social engineering that turned every shared memory into a lie. As the timeline approached the current year, the tone of the letters shifted from romantic longing to a desperate, high-stakes urgency. They started discussing the exit, a term that appeared in multiple letters without ever being fully defined, though the context suggested a final transition that would leave Kofi behind. In a letter from January 2024, Zola mentioned a secret account in Mauritius, a safety net for when the theater finally closes, funded by dividends from a project Elias had ostensibly helped Kofi set up. Kofi realized that his business successes weren't just his own. They were being harvested to fund the very life his wife and best friend planned to live without him. He looked at the stacks of paper, the physical evidence of a decade of grooming, and felt a profound sense of isolation. He was in a house he paid for, with a woman he adored, in a life he had built, yet he was a ghost in his own story, a footnote in a grand romance between two people who had decided he was the only thing standing in their way. The mechanical click of the wall clock seemed to sync with the frantic thudding of Kofi's heart as he reached for the final envelope at the bottom of the stack. Unlike the others, this one was unsealed, the flap tucked in loosely as if it had been placed there in a hurry, or perhaps left open as an invitation. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, the texture of the linen different from the earlier correspondence, and his eyes locked onto the date at the top, yesterday. The ink was dark, fresh, and the handwriting was Zola's, but it was frantic, the letters sprawling across the page with a lack of control that suggested a total emotional collapse. It was dated the day Elias died, the day the world thought a successful man had simply succumbed to a momentary darkness. In the letter, Zola didn't speak of the plan or the exit. She spoke of an end that she hadn't authorized. "You weren't supposed to leave me here with him," she wrote, the words smudged by what looked like a dried tear. "You promised that the box would stay closed until we were both gone, but now you force my hand, and I don't know if I can keep looking him in the eye knowing you're not waiting on the other side." The implication of the date was a physical blow that left Kofi gasping for air in the silent study. If she had written this yesterday, it meant that even as she sat across from him at dinner, even as she accepted his comfort over the loss of their mutual friend, she was mourning the man she truly belonged to. The yesterday on that page turned the last 24 hours into a grotesque farce, a final act of a play that had finally lost its director. He looked at the words, "force my hand," and felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. What had Elias done? Had the suicide been a final move in the game, or a sudden, catastrophic error in judgment? The letter ended abruptly, with a sentence that chilled Kofi to his core. "I will do what you asked in the final video, Elias, but God help us both if Kofi ever finds the key beneath the lid." Kofi's gaze snapped back to the mahogany box, his fingers trembling as he felt along the interior rim of the lid, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Underneath the letter lay a final, separate note, written not in Zola's elegant hand, but in Elias's bold, masculine script, the dead man's ink. It was a confession directed not to Zola, but to Kofi, a final testament from a man who knew he would be a memory by the time these words were read. "Kofi, if you're reading this, it means I lack the strength to see the exit through." The note began, the tone jarringly different from the man Kofi had known for 20 years. Elias wrote about a darkness that had begun to eclipse the thrill of the long game, a realization that by winning Zola, he had lost the only person who actually saw him as a brother. He confessed that the plan to transfer Zola to Kofi had originally been a temporary measure to protect her from a business scandal 5 years ago, but it had spiraled into an obsession that neither of them could control. He admitted to watching them through the years, fueled by a sick mixture of jealousy and pride, realizing too late that he had built a perfect life for his friend while destroying his own peace of mind. The note became increasingly erratic toward the end, the ink bleeding into the paper where the pen had pressed too hard. "She chose you in the end, Kofi, even if she doesn't know it yet," Elias wrote, a sentence that contradicted everything the letters had suggested. "She thinks she loves me, but she only loves the version of me that lives in the dark. I am choosing death not because I hate you, but because I cannot live as the shadow in your house anymore." It was a confusing, contradictory mess of suicide note, a blend of ego and apology that left Kofi feeling more lost than before. Was Elias trying to save Kofi's marriage with a final lie, or was he admitting to a defeat that Zola refused to accept? The final line of the note was a warning that felt like a curse. "Check the lid, Kofi. The wedding gift I never gave you is waiting." Kofi's hand moved to the underside of the lid, and there, taped securely beneath the velvet lining, was a small, silver key and a USB drive, labeled with the date of his wedding day. The silver key felt impossibly cold against Kofi's palm, its surface etched with the date of his wedding, June 14th. It was a date he had always associated with the beginning of his greatest happiness, but now it felt like the anniversary of crime. He peeled the tape back slowly, the sound of the adhesive tearing echoing in the quiet room, like a serrated blade cutting through silk. He held the key up to the light, realizing it was meant for something small, a jewelry box, a diary, or perhaps a safe deposit box he didn't know existed. Beside it, the USB drive sat like a dormant bomb, its black plastic casing hiding a digital history that promised to incinerate the last of his delusions. He felt a sudden, violent urge to throw the box out the window, to drive to the middle of the Magaliesberg Mountains and bury it in the red earth, to go back to the comfortable lie of his life. But the momentum of the truth was a physical force, a tidal wave that had already breached the sea wall, and he knew there was no going back to the man he had been an hour ago. He looked at the key and remembered a moment during their wedding reception. Elias had leaned in to toast him, his eyes glistening with what Kofi thought was joy, and whispered, I've made sure you have everything you'll ever need, Kofi. Just remember that some gifts take time to open. At the time, Kofi had thought it was a reference to a trust fund or a business lead, a typical Elias grand gesture. Now, he realized the gift was the very betrayal he was currently dissecting. The key represented a locked portion of Zola's life, a physical space where she kept the remnants of her true self, hidden away from the husband she was paid to love. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy and uncertain, and began to pace the study. He looked at the wedding photos on the wall, the smiles, the flowers, the way Zola leaned into him, and saw only the choreography. The key was a bridge to a reality he wasn't sure he could survive, but the curiosity was a sickness, a fever that only more truth could break. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, Kofi inserted the USB drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, the light casting a ghostly blue pallor over his face, making him look like a man who had already passed into the afterlife. The drive was organized with military precision, folders labeled by year, then by month, dating back to 2018. He clicked on the folder marked the Introduction 2023, and a list of video files appeared. He selected the first one, dated 3 weeks before he accidentally met Zola at that gala in Sandton. The video opened on a high-resolution shot of Elias's penthouse, the city lights twinkling in the background. Elias was sitting on a sofa, a glass of cognac in his hand, talking to someone off camera. "He likes the red dress, Zola," Elias said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing a marketing strategy. "The one with the low back. And remember, don't mention the London flat. If he asks about your grandmother, use the story about the farm in Natal. It appeals to his sense of heritage." Kofi watched as Zola walked into the frame, wearing the very dress she had worn the night they met. She looked at herself in a mirror, adjusting the strap, her expression blank, professional. "I know the script, Elias," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth Kofi had come to rely on. "But what if he doesn't bite? What if he's not as predictable as you think?" Elias laughed, a sound that made Kofi's skin crawl. "Kofi is the most predictable man I know. He's looking for a soulmate, and I'm going to give him the one I designed. Just stay the course. By this time next year, you'll be the most important person in his life, and I'll be the only person who knows why." The video cut to black, leaving Kofi staring at his own reflection in the darkened screen. He felt a sense of vertigo, as if the floor had suddenly dissolved beneath his feet. His soulmate was a design, his chance encounter a laboratory experiment, and his entire emotional life for the last 3 years had been a series of data points in a man's obsession. He clicked on the next folder, titled Phase 2, The Integration. These videos were shorter, more technical, showing Elias and Zola reviewing blueprints of the house Kofi was planning to buy, the very house he was sitting in now. They discussed where the blind spots in the security system were, which rooms would be best for private conversations, and how to subtly influence Kofi's business decisions to favor Elias's shell companies. It was a forensic dismantling of his autonomy. They were choosing his furniture, his investments, even his vacation spots, all while he thought he was making these choices with his loving partner. In one clip, Zola expressed doubt, her voice trembling slightly. "He's a good man, Elias. He doesn't deserve this." Elias's response was immediate and sharp. "He deserves a life of peace, and you're the only one who can give it to him. If we don't do this, he'll spend his life alone or with someone who doesn't understand him. We're doing him a favor." The twisted logic of the statement was a window into Elias's narcissism. He truly believed he was playing God with Kofi's life. The deeper he went into the folders, the more the videos began to feel like a horror movie. There were clips of them watching him from a distance, surveillance footage from his own office, recordings of his phone calls that Elias had intercepted. He saw himself at his desk, frustrated and tired, while Zola and Elias watched and laughed about how easy it was to steer the ship. The betrayal was multidimensional. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was an intellectual and spiritual hijacking. They had stolen his agency, his privacy, and his right to live a life that was actually his. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage, a heat that started in his chest and radiated outward until his vision blurred. He wanted to scream, to smash the laptop, to burn the house down with everything in it. But he forced himself to keep watching, to see the blueprint to its final, jagged edge. He needed to know the end of the script before the curtain finally fell on the farce of his existence. The video labeled The Gala Night, Final Briefing, was the most painful to watch. It was recorded hours before their first meeting. Zola was sitting in a chair, her eyes red as if she'd been crying, while Elias stood over her, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that looked more like a restraint than a comfort. "This is it, Zola. Tonight you become the woman he's been waiting for. Once you walk through those doors, there is no more us in public. You belong to him now, until I say otherwise." Zola looked up at him, a look of profound, tragic resignation on her face. "And what happens to me, Elias? When the game is over and he finds out, who will I be then?" Elias didn't answer the question, instead leaning down to kiss her forehead. "You'll be safe. That's all that matters." The camera lingered on Zola's face after Elias left the room, her expression shifting from despair to a cold, iron-willed mask, the mask she had worn for Kofi for 3 years. Watching her transform in real time was like watching a masterclass in deception. He saw the exact moment she practiced the accidental spill of the champagne, the way she tilted her head to catch the light, the specific way she lowered her eyelashes when she spoke about feeling a connection. When the video transitioned to the actual footage of the gala, recorded by a hidden camera Elias must have planted or hired a photographer to capture, Kofi saw himself enter the frame. He looked so happy, so oblivious, a lamb walking into a gilded slaughterhouse. He saw the accident happen, saw himself laugh and offer his handkerchief, saw the way Zola looked at him with a feigned shyness that he had mistaken for genuine attraction. He realized then that he had never met Zola. He had met a character played by a woman who was in love with another man. The connection, he felt, was a calculated frequency, tuned to the exact pitch of his own loneliness, and he had fallen for it with a pathetic, eager desperation. The final video file was dated only 2 days before Elias's death. The quality was lower, recorded on a phone in a dimly lit room. The mahogany box was visible on the table in the background. Elias looked haggard, his eyes sunken and his voice a rasping whisper. "Kofi, if you're seeing this, the game has collapsed. I thought I could live with the secret, but the silence is louder than the truth now. I'm leaving you the box because I can't bear the weight of it anymore, and because Zola deserves to be free of me, even if it means losing you." He paused, a long, rattling breath escaping his lungs. "There's a contingency plan. Zola knows what it is. If anything happens to me, you know who to marry. Or rather, you know who you've already married." He looked directly into the camera, a ghost-like smirk flickering on his lips. "She was always yours, Kofi. I just had to convince her of it. But if she stays with you after this, it's because she chose the lie over the ghost. Don't be too hard on her. She was just following the script I wrote for both of you." The screen went black, and for a long moment, the only sound in the study was the low hum of the laptop's cooling fan. The contingency plan was Elias's death, a final, dramatic exit that would force the truth into the light and leave Kofi and Zola to pick up the pieces of their shattered reality. It was the ultimate act of manipulation, a way to ensure that even in death, Elias remained the central figure in their lives. He had made himself a martyr in Zola's eyes and a monster in Kofi's, ensuring that their marriage would forever be haunted by his memory. Kofi felt a cold clarity settle over him, the rage replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. He understood now that Elias hadn't just loved Zola. He had loved the power he held over both of them. The gift wasn't the truth, it was the destruction that the truth brought with it. He sat in the dark, the USB drive still glowing with a small, rhythmic green light, waiting for the one thing he knew was coming next, the sound of the door opening. The click of the front door was a sharp, mechanical snap that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the house. Kofi didn't move. He stayed seated at the desk, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating the debris of his life, the letters, the photo, the silver key. He heard Zola's footsteps on the marble floor, The familiar, rhythmic tap of her heels that usually brought him a sense of peace, but now sounded like a countdown. She paused in the hallway, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, the heavy, charged atmosphere of a room where a secret has just been exhaled. The study door creaked open slowly, a sliver of warm yellow light from the hallway cutting across the floor, until she stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the darkness. She was still in her funeral black, her face pale and drawn, her eyes immediately locking onto the mahogany box sitting open on the desk like a ribcage. The silence between them was thick, a physical barrier that neither seemed willing to break. Zola's gaze moved from the box to the laptop, then finally to Kofi's face, and in that moment, the mask finally, irrevocably shattered. The pale confession wasn't a spoken word. It was the way her shoulders slumped, the way her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob that had been 3 years in the making. She didn't offer a lie. She didn't try to explain away the evidence. She simply stood there, a woman caught in the ruins of a collapsed stage, looking at the man she had been paid to deceive. "He made me promise not to tell you," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing that barely carried across the room. "He said if I told you, he would take everything away, not just the money, not just the life, but you. He said you'd hate me, and I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me the way you're looking at me right now." Kofi stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, the physical embodiment of a man who had nothing left to lose. He walked around the desk until he was inches away from her, the scent of her perfume, the same scent from the 2018 photo, filling his lungs like a toxic gas. "How much of it was real, Zola?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, a vibration of pure, suppressed agony. "The nights we spent talking about the future, the way you looked at me on our wedding day, the I love yous, was any of it yours, or was it all just Elias's ink on your tongue?" Zola's eyes welled with tears, a cascade of grief that felt, for the first time, entirely authentic. "I didn't want to love you, Kofi. That wasn't part of the plan. I was supposed to be a ghost, a caretaker, but then you. You were so kind. You were everything he said you were, and everything he wasn't. I fell in love with the man I was supposed to be destroying, and that was the one thing Elias didn't script." She reached out to touch his arm, but he recoiled as if her skin were made of fire. "Don't," he spat, the word a jagged glass shard. "Don't tell me about love. You lived a double life in this house for 3 years. You wrote him letters yesterday, the day he died, telling him you couldn't look me in the eye. Was that part of the real love, too?" Zola collapsed into the chair, her face buried in her hands, her sobs racking her thin frame. "He was my first love, Kofi. He was the one who saved me when I had nothing. I owed him my life, but I gave you my soul, and I've been tearing myself apart trying to keep them both. He chose to die because he knew I had finally chosen you, and he couldn't live in a world where he wasn't the protagonist anymore. He didn't leave you that box to be honest. He left it to kill us. He wanted to make sure that if he couldn't have me, you couldn't have me either." The argument felt circular, a whirlpool of blame and grief that offered no exit. Kofi turned back to the mahogany box, his eyes catching on a small, velvet-lined compartment he hadn't fully explored in his initial frenzy. He reached in and pulled out a small, navy blue velvet ring case, the kind used for high-end engagement rings. It felt heavy, a solid weight that promised one final, crushing revelation. He opened the case, and there, nestled in the silk, was a platinum band, identical in every way to his own wedding ring, but with a chilling difference. He pulled it out and held it up to the light, his eyes narrowing as he read the engraving on the inner rim. It was his name, Kofi, but it had been violently struck through with a jagged, engraved line, as if someone had taken a needle to the metal in a fit of rage. Beneath the crossed-out name was a second engraving, smaller, but perfectly clear, property of Elias. The ring was a false heirloom, a symbol of the ownership Elias felt he still held over Kofi's life and marriage. It was a grotesque parody of a wedding band, a physical manifestation of the long game that viewed Kofi as a temporary occupant of a seat that Elias had already reserved. Kofi felt a cold, sharp laughter bubble up in his throat, a sound that bordered on madness. He even engraved the betrayal, Kofi whispered, showing the ring to Zola. He wanted me to know that even when I was putting a ring on your finger, I was just a placeholder. He branded my marriage like a piece of livestock. Zola looked at the ring, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, the horror of Elias's obsession finally reaching its peak. I never saw that, she gasped, her voice trembling. Kofi, I swear I never saw that ring. He must have had it made after we were married, a secret he kept for himself. The ring sat on the desk between them, a small, silver circle that contained the entirety of their shared destruction. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that Elias's love for Zola was inseparable from his desire to dominate Kofi. He hadn't just wanted the woman. He wanted to win the woman from the man he called his best friend, to prove that even in his absence, his will was the dominant force. The crossed-out name was the ultimate viral moment of the tragedy, a visual summary of a decade of envy and manipulation. Kofi looked at Zola, who was watching him with a desperate, pleading hope, as if waiting for him to tell her that they could still survive this. But as he looked at her, he didn't see the woman he loved. He saw the blueprint, the script, the letters to my E, and the reflection of a dead man's obsession in her eyes. He won, Zola, Kofi said, his voice devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead sound that seemed to drain the last of the warmth from the room. He chose death to make sure we could never be just US again. Every time I look at you, I'll see the photo from 2018. Every time I touch you, I'll wonder if you're thinking about the letters. Every time I wear my ring, I'll think of this one with my name crossed out. He picked up the mahogany box and walked toward the window, looking out at the city of Johannesburg, the shadow of Sandton stretching long and dark across the landscape. The city looked the same, but the man looking at it was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version of himself. He realized that the greatest cruelty Elias had committed wasn't the lie. It was giving him the truth when it was too late to do anything but drown in it. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the velvet lining he had ripped away, was a final slip of paper, yellowed and brittle. It wasn't a letter or a script. It was a simple, handwritten note from Elias's youth, dated 20 years ago, when they were just boys with nothing but their friendship. It read, "I'll always have your back, Kofi, no matter what." The irony was the final, twisting knife. He realized that Elias's obsession had grown out of the very love that had once been pure, a fraternal bond that had curdled into a poisonous need for control. The final note in the box, the one mentioned in the will, was tucked inside the ring case. "I love her first, but she chose you, so I chose death. I hope the truth is enough to keep you both warm." It was a spiteful, elegant goodbye, a final act of arson from a man who wanted to be remembered as the fire. Kofi looked at Zola one last time. She was waiting for a verdict, for a scream, for a hand to hold. Instead, he simply handed her the mahogany box, the silver key, and the USB drive. "You take it," he said, his voice a ghost of his former self. "It's your history, not mine. I'm leaving, and I'm not taking anything that Elias designed." He walked out of the study, through the marble hallway, and out into the cool Johannesburg night, leaving the door wide open. He didn't know where he was going, only that for the first time in 5 years, he was walking into a future that wasn't scripted. Behind him, in the glass-walled house, Zola sat in the dark with the ruins of a dead man's love, realizing that the only thing Elias had truly succeeded in doing was making sure they were both, finally and completely, alone. Was a marriage, or just a 3-year rehearsal? Elias chose death to remain the ghost in our bed, leaving me with a woman who was never truly mine. Tell me, would you burn the truth or walk away? Follow for the final revelation.